So yes, so this is number 8, and we're going to do a total of 9, so our penultimate one. And last week we looked at conversion in both directions in the Middle Ages, and we also discussed the Reformation. And we're going to stay in the early years of the Reformation, which coincides, it's sort of sometimes called the early modern period. And we're going to look, first of all, at the remarkable story of Johannes Reuchlin. And Johannes Reuchlin was a German Catholic lawyer and scholar in the 16th century. And he stood up almost single-handedly against a campaign that aimed to destroy all Hebrew and Jewish books, apart from the Bible, in the Holy Roman Empire, which is roughly where Germany is more or less now. And some of the aspects of the story are worth considering on their own merit. So the emergence of what's called Christian Hebraism, the interest of Christians in Jewish stuff, is at this time too. So we're going to have a little look at that. And we'll also consider, because this was part of the story too, the revolutionary influence of the invention and spread of printing in Western Europe. So we've got various things we're going to cover today. Next week, we're going to ignore the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, and we're going to look at the effect of the Holocaust on relationships between Christians and Jews, because that is still enduring, and that's very much what started off the situation we're in today. So back to the end, first of all, of the 15th century. And this was a time when there was a wave of expulsions of Jews from various European communities. And the two biggest were, of course, the expulsion of all Jews who refused to convert to Christianity from Spain in 1492, followed by a very similar expulsion of Jews from Portugal in 1497. And I'll just share here a map of various, they're not all, expulsions of Jews between 1100 and 1600, and you can see there were a lot. They're by no means all listed there, but you can see Jews were, through no fault of their own, considerably on the move for various reasons, usually just people disliking them, or sometimes they were forced conversion campaigns, which led to people either having to or deciding to leave. Sometimes it was just violence. Sometimes laws were passed and Jews were forced out of communities. So the immediate causes were quite varied. So we're not going to go into them enormously, but this is useful knowledge for what is happening at this stage. And you can see they go on quite late. So even the Papal States you have in the 16th century, and Naples in the 16th century. So it's a series of processes that's going on at the time. Now, if we go back to thinking about the actual expulsions in Central Europe, and particularly in Spain and Portugal, we don't actually know how many Jews were expelled at this point. And the lowest figure for the expulsion from Spain is about 40,000 Jews, and the highest figure is in the region of 150,000 Jews, but we don't know at all exactly. I'd recommend reading Beinart's book on the expulsion. There are other books too. And the figures for other expulsions are even harder to estimate because the Spanish one is pretty well documented, but some of the others weren't really very well documented at all. And if we focus in on the Holy Roman Empire, which at the time was a collection of some 300 plus states, mini-states, bishoprics, what have you, that roughly covered the area of modern Germany, there were more than 22 expulsions from particular cities and regions in the 15th century. So it was going on a localized basis a lot of the time. Not everyone, everywhere, all the time, but quite frequently in many different places as a sort of regular thing. This is the backdrop to what we're talking about now. Okay, so Jews were moving, as we said, eastwards to the Ottoman Empire, where it was often much easier to get on with your life, around the Mediterranean, off to Eastern Europe. And it was a sort of time of decline for the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe. But it was also, surprisingly, a time when there was a lot of interest among Christians in Jewish literature and in studying Hebrew. So you've got these rather contradictory things going on in Europe at this time. And a major figure in this new interest in Jewish learning and Jewish literature was Johannes Reuchlin. So this is the movement very loosely called Christian Hebraism. They probably wouldn't have called themselves Christian Hebraists. This is a modern term to include a whole load of people who were doing roughly the same thing, but not necessarily exactly the same thing, and not always for the same reasons. And Johannes Reuchlin was one of the greatest exponents, you could say. He was born in 1455 in Pforzheim, quite a small town in South Germany, and he was born to quite a well-to-do family, so he had a good education, and he traveled widely. And as people did in those days, he studied law at different universities in France, plus, a little bit more unusually, he studied Greek in Germany and in Rome. And he acquired expert knowledge of Greek. It was becoming very fashionable now in the Renaissance. And one of the things that aided the study of Greek was the fact that in 1453, Constantinople had fallen to the Turks. And as a result, there were a lot of refugees from Constantinople fleeing westwards into Europe. And because, of course, the Byzantine Empire that had just fallen was Greek speaking, one of the things you could do as a refugee scholar was you could teach Greek to enthusiasts in the West who wanted to learn ancient languages. So that's another thing that feeds into the Renaissance interest in going back to the classical sources, to Latin sources and Greek sources, because Greek was not widely known in Western Europe before this time. Having learned Greek and Latin, the next ancient language that any respectable scholar of this time would want to deal with would be Hebrew, because it is the language of the Bible. So Reuchlin, after becoming an expert in Greek, then he went several times to Rome and he continued to study there. And he met somebody else who was a very early Christian Hebraist, Pico della Mirandola, who's a very important figure in the Renaissance in his own right for all sorts of reasons. He was very interested in Kabbalah. And so Reuchlin learned from him partly, but also learned of all people with the great biblical commentator, Rabbi Ovadia Sforno. And some of you may have read Sforno's commentaries on the Torah. And it's fascinating to think that Reuchlin actually sat and learnt with him, and that Sforno was interested in teaching Christians Hebrew and how to read the Bible in Hebrew, and presumably explaining his own ideas of interpretation of the Bible to his pupils. So there's another little tangle in our histories where you have pious Jews teaching pious Christians how to read the Bible in Hebrew. So I might say, by the way, that Sforno himself was a philosopher and mathematician and very much a product of the Renaissance in his own terms, as well as traditionally writing a commentary on the Torah. So Reuchlin came back from Rome with lots of Hebrew books, and we're going to look at the history of Hebrew books and printing after we've talked about Reuchlin himself, but they were available. So he went back to Germany, and for many years he taught both Hebrew and Greek at the University of Heidelberg, as well as practicing law at the same time. And I can see, Shelley, you've got a question, so do let me know what it is.
Okay, I'm wondering, the Jews who were teaching Hebrew to these Christian Hebraicists, was this done voluntarily, or is this like the disputations?
No, this is voluntarily.
Okay,
you would be paid. They would be paid for it. It was a good way of, earning a few ducats or whatever it was on the side, and they may have formed friendships with people of scholarly inclinations. The disputations are quite different. The disputations were set up by monastic orders, usually the Dominicans, who would insist that the local ruler hold a public disputation between Jews and Christians. Often the Christian side was represented by a converted Jew who could quote the Talmud back at the Jews. They were very staged, very artificial. The result was usually a foregone conclusion. The one in which Nachmanides, Ramban, was involved actually was odd, because the king decided he'd won, but then he got chased out of town anyway. So I think they weren't happening quite so much at this point. Ramban's one is in 12, I can't remember what, so that's a bit earlier. They hadn't really been very successful in persuading Jews to convert either. But they were very, very different situations. And just as I'm answering a question, I'm just going to have a little look on the chat. Didn't a lot of Spanish Jews go to Portugal and be expelled again? Yes. Pforzheim is not on the map. No, it's very small. And I'm not sure if there was an expulsion of Jews from Pforzheim. So if not, they wouldn't be on the map. Was his interest in Judaism limited only to the intellectual, well-to-do class? Yes, absolutely. But it was also true in the Jewish world. The only people who were actually sort of sitting down and reading commentary at this stage would have been the elite, not the masses, not Jews who were working at the bottom of the social stratum. They wouldn't have had very much knowledge. We don't hear very much about them, but there was certainly some Jewish illiteracy. Not all Jews were literate at all. Not all Jews were interested in learning Torah. So the two societies were quite powerful. And Deb has said there's a great YouTube video called Disputation. Yes, that's a play by Chaim Maccabee that is based on Ramban's own account of the disputation. And that particular disputation, fascinatingly, we have the account written by the Dominican involved, and we have Ramban's account. They don't quite tally, as you might expect. Both sides sort of write a version that has them coming out as the winner. But I have to say, Nachmanides does seem to have won, because the king adjudicated and said, yeah, this rabbi is very convincing. So unusually in that case, it does seem the Jewish side won, but it didn't do Ramban any good. That's why he left Spain and had to go off to the land of Israel. Okay, so if we go back to Reuchlin, so I'm just going to choose the chat so I can see to hand out properly. So Reuchlin, being in terms of his time a sort of world expert on Hebrew, or certainly the Christian community, published a book which was hugely influential and was used by people for years and years, centuries. This book was used, De Rudimentis Hebraicus, The Rudiments of Hebrew. And he published this in 1506, and of course it was printed because this is the beginning of printing. And here is the first page. And as an example for reading Hebrew letters, he has charmingly put in the genealogy of the Virgin Mary. So you can see already this is an interesting thing to choose. And it's just the names Adam, Shet, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalel, etc., etc. Some interesting transliterations there, because this is written in Latin and it's difficult. There is no sh in Latin, so Shem comes out as Sem, for instance. And just above it in Latin is written, here begins the genealogy of the Virgin Mary, from whom that man who was born who is King of Kings and the greatest and best God. So it's learning Hebrew, but in a very Christian sort of way. And this is the beginning of a whole new attitude to Jews. Not that the Jews are wicked, evil people who really need to be suppressed and kept in a position of complete suppression, and we don't care about their stuff, and all their books are evil, and we don't need to know any of their knowledge. This is the beginnings of a move to say Jewish knowledge is valuable, and we want to be able to read the Bible in Hebrew, and we will listen to Jews when they teach us. It's not the same as saying Judaism is fine, definitely not, but it's the beginning of a change in attitude that is the part of this outgrowth of this Renaissance idea that all knowledge is valuable, and that different languages and different cultures have something to say to your own culture, which was by no means a widespread idea beforehand. So Latin is the intellectual language of the time. So of course you write your Hebrew grammar book in Latin, because nobody's printing in German. That's for the, German is for the lower classes. Proper language is Latin. And this was the very first book that meant that non-Jews could actually learn Hebrew by themselves without finding a Jew who would agree to teach them, or finding a Jew at all, depending on where you lived. And in fact, it was used by Martin Luther, the pioneer of the Reformation. It was used by Ulrich Zwingli, who we talked about a little last time, one of the major figures of the Reformation in Switzerland. They both learnt Hebrew to some extent out of Reuchlin's Hebrew grammar, because that's what you did up to the 19th century. I think Reuchlin's grammar was still being used by non-Jews. Jews have plenty of grammar books of their own, but non-Jews would turn to Reuchlin if they wanted to learn. And interestingly, because how are you going to print Hebrew? It's all very well books being printed, but here he is in the middle of Germany, and where he lives, there are no Hebrew presses. So he cooperated with a printer in his hometown, a gentleman called Thomas Anshelm, and Thomas Anshelm developed Hebrew fonts for printing, and he published a lot of books by Reuchlin, including this particular Hebrew grammar. And if you look at it, you can see that the script here is your classic medieval Ashkenazi script that you get in manuscripts. And that's obviously what Thomas Anshelm did. He got himself a couple of Hebrew manuscripts. Reuchlin said, no, this letter is called an aleph, and I want this letter, and I want this letter, and this letter comes at the end. I don't know that Thomas Anshelm would have been able to read Hebrew, but he certainly knew enough about it to be able to compose a font that could be used in the book. So that is very interesting too, that you have a non-Jew almost certainly using Jewish manuscripts in order to design one of the very first Hebrew fonts. Now, not the first Hebrew fonts used by Jews, but probably the first Hebrew fonts used by non-Jews. So we said that in addition to a very distinguished academic career, Reuchlin was a lawyer. And in that capacity, he also served as a counselor to Duke Eberhard of Württemberg, which was a little duchy in the south of Germany, which would have been a little independent state. And Duke Eberhard was a great patron of humanist studies, and he had founded the University of Tübingen, which is still around, in 1477. So it was obviously a cultural hotspot, an academic hotspot. And in his role as counselor to the Duke, Reuchlin carried out a lot of diplomatic missions. He was sort of served as the ambassador of the Duchy of Württemberg in Rome at the court of the Pope. So he was well-traveled, well-placed, had powerful political support, was a great academic. But all of it, and has many facets to his career. But of all those facets, his studies of Hebrew and his defense of the Hebrew books are what have been understood as most important in his life, as much as for what followed what he did as for that work itself. And there's this wonderful book by David Price called Johannes Reuchlin, the Campaign to Destroy Jewish Books, which is a fabulous read. And he points out that the discovery of Hebrew, which for all intents and purposes was previously unknown to Christians, created new connections between the bifurcated theological worlds of the two faiths, and as such would eventually form a new context for Christian-Jewish coexistence. Now, it didn't happen in Reuchlin's lifetime, that's very important to say. And Reuchlin himself seems to have developed really over time from somebody who thought that, you know, it was a good idea to learn Hebrew because after all the Bible, but you could also use it for converting Jews when you explained to them why they were wrong. And he seems to have thought of that at the beginning of his career, but if you look at his later works, he seems to have come to a more tolerant point of view in which he said, yeah, you know, the Hebrew Bible is the authoritative version, and Jewish books are valuable, and maybe we don't need to convert everyone. I don't think he actually said that out loud, but he stopped the conversion talk. So for that age, that is pretty amazing. So the tiny number of Christian scholars earlier on, some of whom it must be said were Jews who converted to Christianity, who had any knowledge of Hebrew, had been using it really only to assess the standard Latin translation of the Bible, the Vulgate, which had been produced in the late 4th, early 5th centuries by Jerome, who's a saint in the Catholic Church. Sometimes it was used to try and dig into the Bible in a way to attack Jews, to sort of use their scriptures against them. Generally, these scholars were not interested in the Talmud, or in the case of some of the Jews who converted, would accuse the Talmud of being a pernicious book that encouraged Jews to hate Christians. But Reuchlin was different. He wasn't interested in attacking Jewish literature. He wanted to find out what it said, which was a new approach altogether. And he had a particularly high opinion of Jewish biblical commentary and was very prepared to use that. And he was aware of the fact that the church, the Catholic Church, had actually instructed universities to offer Hebrew education back at the Council of Vienna in 1312. They hadn't actually done it much, but the Catholic Church itself had, in the early 14th century, actually tried to promote the teaching of Hebrew. And he used this later on in his campaign to support the defense of the Hebrew books and stop them being destroyed. And he wrote on this, "Indeed, I am aware of the deplorable plight of the Jews in our own time. They have been expelled not only from Spain, but also from the borders of our Germany, forced to find homes for themselves elsewhere, and even to emigrate to the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, we can expect that the Hebrew language, along with a great loss of holy scriptures, will disappear and vanish from our midst. For this reason, in order to bring knowledge of the Hebrew language to Christians, I have decided to lay the first foundation with this book, as is provided for in the constitutions of Pope Clement V, which was at the Council of Vienna in 1312. So he prefaces this saying, you know, the Jews are disappearing from our lands. It's good for Christians to know Hebrew. That's really important. This is why I've written the book. And by the way, I have papal sanction. So that was a bit of a covering of the backside, you could say, so that nobody could go, you are a heretic and a Judaizer, and why are you publishing a book teaching Hebrew? But he sounds, you can hear that sounds quite sympathetic. He's not saying anything like, you know, they have brought it upon themselves and they are wicked people and they deserve to be driven out. So one of the most important effects of Reuchlin's research, and of the scholars who used this to look at the Bible, was it did reveal the mistakes and the unreliability of that official version in Latin of the Bible, the Vulgate. And interestingly, when called upon to decide between the sanctified Latin version of Saint Jerome and his knowledge of Hebrew, Reuchlin wrote in a letter, "I revere St. Jerome as an angel, and I respect Nicholas of Lyra, a sort of 13th century Christian Bible commentator, as a great teacher. But I worship the Hebrew truth as God." In other words, it's all very well having translations, but the Bible was written in Hebrew, and that is the ultimate authority. I cannot, however much I respect St. Jerome, I cannot agree with him if he has translated something wrong. And that also is an unusual attitude, because many Christians at this time would have said, well, if St. Jerome translated it that way, then, whatever it says in the Hebrew, we don't care, the Jews have got it wrong. This is the proper one. So we have a shift here. And though Reuchlin, in this introduction to his book, The Rudiments of Hebrew, presents the learning of Hebrew as a specifically Christian project, in which he thought a new Bible translation based on the Hebrew would provide a better and firmer foundation for Christian theology, he was perfectly happy to use Jewish scholarship in this project. And he clearly consulted many major medieval Jewish grammar works, including the great Rabbi David Kinchi's Hebrew Grammar, the Guide of the Perplexed by Maimonides. There are quotes and references to that. Yehuda Halevi's very famous Defense of Judaism, the Kuzari. And of course, he read Rashi's commentary on the Bible and used other sources as well. So Reuchlin was familiar with a wide and varied range of Jewish literature that went well beyond the Bible, and he used it. He thought that these people had things to teach him. This is, again, the unusual thing. And in doing this, he established Jewish research on the Bible as authoritative and appropriate for Christians to use. So here again, we have another Christian Jewish unexpected connection right back in the early 16th century. And as a result of Reuchlin's work, Hebrew became very, very popular at German universities. And a letter written by Reuchlin in the 1920s, when he was teaching at the University of Tübingen, says his lecture hall was swamped by 400 students who wanted to learn both Greek and Hebrew. Well, I don't think you get 400 students at any university today sort of crowding the lecture hall and going, we demand to read Hebrew. So that's pretty good. And of course, there was this knock-on effect on theologians, as we said before. Zwingli and Luther, two of the founding figures of the Reformation, used Reuchlin and used some of his ideas as well. And in 1517, Reuchlin published another book, The Art of Kabbalah, one of the very first Christian books ever to be written about the Kabbalah, the Jewish medieval mystical tradition. And most unusually for its time, that doesn't depict Jews as demonic or misguided, but keeps pointing out commonalities between Christianity and Judaism. And his book depicted the history of Jewish scholarship and religious life as the ongoing story of God's people. So Reuchlin has come quite a long way in his own life and is voicing ideas that are very, very new in his world. And as far as he could see, Judaism is a different religious search from that of Christianity, but it does have its own worth and dignity. And he saw Jewish sages and rabbis as powerful theologians and philosophers who taught a way of life that was of benefit to all humanity. He's still not a modern thinker. He also values Kabbalah because he thinks its teachings can reinforce Christian faith in Jesus as the Messiah. And he did give some rather Trinitarian interpretations of some of the Hebrew names of God. But unlike almost every other writer of his time, and certainly all the earlier medieval writers, he does not present the end of his dialogue with Jews as their conversion to Christianity. That's not the point for him. So his book is particularly daring and unusual because it appeared right in the middle of his own trial for heresy as a result of his defense of Jewish literature. And we'll look at that great controversy in a moment. We have to meet one of the characters first. So again, in all sorts of ways, Reuchlin was way out of his time, really, really ahead of his time. So this part of the story, the Great Heresy Trial, starts with a Jew who converted to Christianity in about 1505, born in Nuremberg, about 1469, and known as Johannes Pfefferkorn. He seems to have been Yosef when he was Jewish. We don't know why he converted, but he spent much of his later life trying to damage the Jewish community from which he had come. And in 1507, he published a terrible book called Der Judenspiegel, The Mirror of the Jews, in which he demanded that Jews should give up money lending, they should attend Christian sermons, they should abandon the Talmud, and he also wanted to destroy and confiscate and destroy all Jewish books, because he claimed it was only the books that kept Jews within their Jewish faith, which is actually a very good observation and one you might expect from somebody who actually had grown up Jewish. He knew the role of books in Jewish life. And he went on a complete campaign to try and wipe out Jewish books. And in his book from 1509, The Enemy of the Jews, he writes, the Jews cause many Christians, learned and unlearned, to doubt their faith. Thus there is much heresy where Jews live. Now God will no longer save them or hear their prayers, because they have committed greater sins than their forefathers who killed the prophets. They have killed the Son of God. They must do all kinds of menial work, such as cleaning the streets or sweeping chimneys or emptying the cesspools of toilets and removing dog manure. And in the meantime, as I have often said, we must not allow them to keep the false books of the Talmud, and we should leave them nothing except the text of the Bible alone. If that is done, they undoubtedly will adopt a different mind and heart, and then they will abandon their false beliefs and follow the truth of our faith. So there seems to be something going on with Pfefferkorn. We don't know his relationships in the Jewish community, but one imagines that there was a whole psychological story behind his incredible efforts to try and hurt the community he had left. And he used his contacts among the Franciscans to try and push this further. The Franciscans were a very widespread area, and by the Franciscans, he got as far as the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and persuaded him to issue a decree confiscating Jewish books in 1509. So we'll see how that worked out. And because it's complicated, I put the timeline of what was known as the Reuchlin affair on here. So 1507, Pfefferkorn publishes his Mirror of the Jews, kicking off the campaign to confiscate and destroy books, and found his allies among the Franciscans. And then things went further. Pfefferkorn moved around the country, starting in Frankfurt, and he began the process there. He confiscated 168 books from the Frankfurt synagogue in the September of 1509. And he had managed to persuade the Emperor Maximilian to issue this decree just before that, and to appoint him as the inspector who would decide whether these books were okay or not. And obviously, Pfefferkorn being Pfefferkorn, he was going to decide not. The Jews fought back. The Jews lobbied the Archbishop of Mainz, a gentleman called Uriel von Gömmingen, to ask the emperor to appoint a commission to investigate Pfefferkorn. And the emperor agreed to that as well, quite happily, and decided, yes, he would do that as well. And he put the Archbishop von Gömmingen in charge. And now there was a commission of Pfefferkorn, 4 university professors, another Jewish convert called Victor von Karben, who'd been a rabbi before he became a priest, an inquisitor called Höchstraten, and Reuchlin, and they were all put on this commission together, and they were all from very, very different sides. And on went the book confiscations in at least 6 German cities. So frantic efforts were then made by the Frankfurt Jews to save their books, and they petitioned the city council. The city council very nicely also objected to this whole process and trying to annul the decree. It didn't seem to help much. Pfefferkorn got another 1,500 books in Frankfurt, and all sorts of things were going on. The Jewish community were paying bribes to speak to the Archbishop and other people to speak to the emperor on their behalf. And it began gradually to swing in the other direction. So by May, the Emperor Maximilian had been persuaded to return the books, but you note, as long as the Jews renegotiated a major loan to one of his military allies. So yeah, there was sort of a bit of a price there. It was used as leverage. It must have been very convenient for Maximilian. In July, he had his doubts, presumably under all this onslaught of bribery and various people whispering in his ear. He ordered an assessment of how legal it really was to confiscate and destroy all these books. And the commission were asked to decide on that. All the commissioners, except for Reuchlin, said that confiscation and destruction of the Hebrew books were both legal and desirable. And Reuchlin, at considerable personal risk, stood up and said no. And he published a little pamphlet called The Recommendation, opposing this enormously. And he based this on legal grounds. Remember, he was a lawyer, on both ecclesiastical, on church law, and civil law. And fascinatingly, he also based it on the argument that we and the Jews are fellow citizens of one and the same Roman Empire. And he also denied that Jewish books were either heretical or blasphemous. And those were very dangerous things to say at the time. I mean, first of all, the idea that you could be a fellow citizen with a Jew was absolutely unheard of. The second, the idea that Jews weren't necessarily heretics or wicked, evil people was also very, very unusual. Because he had such enormous status as a leading lawyer, it meant he had really basically stopped the campaign single-handedly, because he was his authority was in legal matters was so high, and his standing was so high, that they couldn't really go on with the campaign. Not when somebody of that stature said, "I'm sorry, what you're doing is not legal, not under church law, not under civil law." This didn't quite end everything. 1511, Pfefferkorn was back again, publishing a new attack, both on the Jews and on Reuchlin this time, called the Magnifying Glass. The actual campaign to confiscate books subsided, so it seems no more were actually confiscated. And the inquisitor who'd been on the commission then decided he would try Reuchlin for heresy. So poor old Reuchlin tried to get Reuchlin, poor old Hoogstraten tried to get Reuchlin under the heresy laws, and various trials went on and on. It dragged on for many years. First, the Inquisition in Mainz had a go at him. Then he was tried in Rome, but he was finally acquitted. And this was a big deal. This was all over Europe and people knew about it. And it was a bit like the Dreyfus affair. The Reuchlin affair divided a lot of the intelligentsia of Europe. I think most of the humanists were solidly behind Reuchlin. Most of the, I think quite a lot of certain areas of the church were probably solidly behind Pfefferkorn. But it was well known there were pamphlets flying backwards and forwards, and it was a whole enormous celebrated uproar in these years. And you can see it dragged on pretty long. It really went on for a long time. And to be on trial for heresy was no fun thing, because it meant if you were found guilty, you could be killed. And in the middle of all those heresy trials and summonses and uncertain verdicts and what have you, Reuchlin went on publishing books supporting the studying of Jewish literature and furthering that study. His book on Kabbalah was published at this time. So he was quite an amazing person. And it definitely, there was fallout from this in terms of the Reformation. For the first time, a Christian scholar had claimed that Jewish religious literature was valuable, that it was useful for Christians, and had seen something about the Jews that said that they were more than blasphemous heretics and Christ killers and enemies. So that was a very, very early turn in the understanding of the position of Jews and who Jews were and what Jewish culture was worth. And if you follow it down, you get it right down to today and modern departments of Jewish studies at universities. In a way, spiritually, they're all the heirs of Reuchlin, who made the study of Jewish literature and civilization something that was acceptable and respectable. So I think we should all know a bit more about Reuchlin and be a bit more appreciative of him. I'm told there is a statue in Pforzheim, and I think there's some sort of Reuchlin Institute or study center there too. So if you're ever going through Germany and you'll pass Pforzheim, go and have a look and see what they've done for one of their probably most famous native son. So we talked a bit about Reuchlin's role as a Christian Hebraist, in fact, one of the very first figures of Christian Hebraism. And this is very closely connected to his role as a general advocate of humanism in the wider sense. So what was humanism? Very much a Renaissance product. It started around about 1400 in Italy. It spread northwards. It was right the way through the rest of Europe, and it was intertwined with the Renaissance. And by the 1480s, humanism had reached Northern Europe, definitely. There were humanist scholars. Reuchlin was one of the first humanists there, sometimes called Germany's first humanist. And there were 5 subject areas they were particularly interested in: Latin grammar, rhetoric, the art of speaking, that came from the ancient world very much, poetry, moral philosophy, and history. And in particular, their idea of grammar and rhetoric meant going back to classical Latin and Roman literary styles and not using medieval Latin or church Latin, which they regarded as rather degraded. They wanted to go back to the pure Latin of antiquity. And they based their textbooks for these subjects on classical texts, not on the more abstract grammars. There had been grammars in the Middle Ages, but they they were much more a late form of Latin than the pure, who never knows if it really was a pure, but the earlier classical forms of Latin. And they despised medieval Latin very much. Medieval Latin was the working language of the church, most governments, and the schools. The humanists wanted to go back to classical meters for poetry. So medieval Latin poetry is often rhyming and rhythmic. Classical Latin poetry is based on length of syllable, things like hexameters and pentameters, and has no rhyme and not necessarily a particular rhythm. So they wanted to go back to the models of things like Virgil in the Aeneid. That's what they thought was proper. And the promotion of history was a new feature. The Middle Ages generally weren't terribly interested in history. Again, the humanists went back to ancient historians like Pliny and Tacitus, and they wrote histories of the Middle Ages and histories of their own times based on these classical models very much. And for humanists, the study of history was meant to inculcate virtue or values in people and to inspire them to seek honor and greatness. So for them, the study of history was a moral enterprise. And I've put up a picture here of Erasmus, who was really the poster boy of certainly of Northern European humanism. Here he is in all his glory. He certainly was a pioneer in Greek and issued a critical edition of the New Testament in Greek, which caused quite a stir and was a major feature in the Reformation. I'm not sure, I think he might have dabbled a bit in Hebrew, but he didn't do anything very normal. He wasn't a Christian Hebraist, he was just a humanist, but very much a symbol of the ones who came after him. So the humanists, actually, wait a minute, one sec, I will just have a little look and see what is going on in the chat. Are there source sheets? Yes, that we put in. Where are we? Text obviously copied from a codex. Well, a codex just means a book. But yes, it would be from a Jewish manuscript of some type. That's Dagesh. Oh, right, yes. Expel from 21st century ideology, reparations now. Well, I don't know. I don't think there's great calls for reparations for medieval expulsions. The Spanish have actually agreed that anyone who had traced their ancestors back to an expellee can have a Spanish passport. It's not bad. I think Portuguese too. It's interesting. Pfefferkorn's work is around the same time as the massacre in Lisbon. Is it as a connection just happenstance? I really don't know, because I don't know about the exact timing. When he was bringing out his books and when the massacre was. I doubt very much. I think things
massacre was in 1506.
1506. I don't know. Jews were getting chucked out of the place all over the time. I don't think that Lisbon would have made a particular impression. My understanding of Pfefferkorn is he's much more motivated by personal motivations that we don't understand. That he really, really had a bust up with the Jewish community, charged off, converted, and then spent the rest of his time trying to do the Jewish community in. And I would doubt that had anything to do with Lisbon. That probably had to do with his own life. I mean, who knows what actually happened? We don't know very much about it. How many of the confiscated books ended up in the Vatican? That's an interesting question. I don't know, but often confiscated books did end up in church collections. One of the major sources for the Hebrew books in the Vatican is actually what was the library, what was called the Collegium Neophytorum, the College of the Neophytes, or College of the Converts. And that was a college set up for converted Jews who wanted to learn to be priests. And what tended to happen was they brought their books along with them, and many of them had been rabbis or at least scholars. So if you were going to be a priest, it helped to have a background. And because priests can't marry and have children, they left their personal collections of Hebrew books to the Collegium. And in about the 19th century, I think, 19th century or early 20th, the Vatican acquired the library of the Collegium Neophytorum, which I think had not been functioning for several years. But all sorts of treasures were found in that library. Like there's a new Targum known as Targum Neophiti from the language of the Collegium Neophytorum that weren't known from other sources. I mean, there was also 125 copies of Rashi's commentary, I expect. But yes, so there is a superb collection of Hebrew manuscripts in the Vatican. And some of it probably does come from confiscation, and some of it, a large chunk of it, comes from that particular college, which was not confiscation, but ex-Jews, if you like, contributing their own libraries. But yes, I couldn't tell you actually what proportion of the Vatican collections is from confiscated books, but I imagine a proportion of it is, definitely. Okay, so back to the humanists. The humanists were particularly interested in the history of the early church as well. They were Christian. They pioneered the use of source criticism, and that is looking at ancient texts to understand them in their own terms and to see how they were composed, to analyze the language, to see what's additions, to see what quotes what something else, and also the use of different manuscripts to establish clean texts and to critique differences and variants between texts. And that often led them to the discovery that some of the texts that were crucial to the Christianity of their own time were actually forgeries. And the best known one is a very famous text called the Donation of Constantine, which was a document that claimed to have been written by the Emperor Constantine and giving huge amounts of power to the papacy. And that document was used constantly to support claims for the Pope's rule in Italy. And it was revealed to be a late forgery. And the person who revealed the fact it was a forgery was a humanist, Lorenzo Valla, very prominent. So the humanists were a bit, persona non grata with the authorities of the Catholic Church, because they kept debunking various useful myths that the Catholics were using to extend their authority. And the humanist interest in moral philosophy also set them off from the medieval scholars. The medieval scholars had been interested, for instance, in Aristotle for his logic. The humanists were interested in Aristotle for his ethics very often. So they looked at different aspects of classical antiquity from their predecessors. They went back to Plato, they went back to Cicero to find out how to live a good and virtuous life, and this was very important to them. And this was the approach that Erasmus used in his studies of the New Testament, looking for Jesus's moral philosophy. That's what concerned him. The great battle cry of the humanists was ad fontes, back to the sources, which of course is very like the Reformation cry of sola scriptura, only the Bible. This idea of going back to the origins of something to get the pure form. And that for the humanists meant reading ancient texts in the original language. You could not read just translations, you would not understand what the text said, especially if some of the translations were not accurate. So they tended not to focus on the church fathers who we looked at, people like Jerome and Origen, and they tended not to look at their biblical interpretation, but to go back to the biblical text and do their own interpretation. So they were very interested in that aspect of things. And so going back to the Hebrew text of the Bible, of the Tanakh, is where we get into Christian Hebraism. And as we said, Reuchlin. So Greek and Roman sources, and then after that, Hebrew sources became a major focus, not for all humanists, but for many. So Reuchlin was a key figure in the beginning of this. We saw first Hebrew grammar and promoting the teaching of Hebrew, but also in changing the image of Jewish religious literature, as we said, from the satanic and evil to something that was useful and worth studying in its own right, a bit sort of lishma, if you like. Also for being used by Christian scholars in developing Christian theology and a Christian understanding of the Bible. And as we said, Reuchlin changed his position over time. He started off a bit on the scornful side, but the further you go in his works, the more respect he is showing to Jewish scholars and commentators. He even described one of the Jewish sages as our glory, which is rather nice. And he pointed out that rather than Jews slandering Christians when they prayed, it was Christians who were slandering Jews in their Good Friday services by calling them perfidious and treacherous. And he also rejected the very commonly held view that the whole of post-biblical Judaism was hostile to Christianity, and he just rejected that totally. Many of his students carried on and expanded the field of Hebrew and Jewish studies. So we're going to have a little look at some of them, because they go right down to today's academic studies of Judaism. And we have, for instance, Andreas Osiander. This is a picture of him, who was a pupil who published a version of the Vulgate that was corrected by reference to the Hebrew text. So you could say an updated, a new and improved Latin translation of the Bible. He also played a crucial role in the Reformation. Others like Paul Fabius, I found two versions of his name, and Sebastian Münster, again wrote Hebrew grammars themselves, wrote various works that actually looked at they looked at Jewish rituals and customs. It was the first time anyone had written on those at all. And they also investigated the Jewish context of Jesus's sayings in the New Testament, which we think of now as quite sort of standard in New Testament studies, but this is the first time it ever happened. And Paul Fagius or Fabius, translated Pirkei Avot into Latin. Again, that was the first ever translation of Pirkei Avot. He published an edition of Targum Onkelos, and fascinatingly, he published a Yiddish, Hebrew, Latin, German dictionary. I do rather wonder if it's the only one of its kind. And he did this in cooperation with a Jewish scholar called Elia Levita, who's very important in the history of Christian Hebraism because he taught Hebrew to a lot of people too. This is just a little bit sort of moving on from writing a little bit after him, overlapping with him. Sebastian Münster published the Hebrew Bible with Latin translation, his own Latin translation, another Hebrew grammar, and he rather oddly translated the Gospel of Matthew into Hebrew. Or at least it may have been based on a version he got from Spanish conversos, and I have no idea why Spanish conversos would have translated the Gospel of Matthew into Hebrew, and apparently they did. Elia Levita himself was a great Renaissance figure. Sort of, you could say he was, obviously he wasn't a Christian Hebraist, he was a Jewish Hebraist, but he was very much a humanist in Jewish terms. And he himself published grammars. He was a scholar, he was a poet, and fascinatingly, he wrote the Bava Buch, which was an immensely popular chivalric romance. Think Arthur. He wrote this in Yiddish. It was based on an Anglo-Norman romance called Bevis of Hampton. And the Bava Buch was one of the major light secular reading works of the Renaissance and later for Yiddish speakers. So he was a man of many, many talents. He himself lived in the house of a cardinal, the Cardinal Giles of Viterbo, for over a decade, taught him Hebrew, taught Fagius and Münster Hebrew, taught the Bishop of Laval, who was the French ambassador in Venice, taught him Hebrew. So again, he was a great teacher of Christian humanists. You can see this chain of influence of Jews and Christians swapping knowledge and educating each other. And there was really a sort of a conversation going on here. And if we go back to David Ruderman up here, he notes that Hebraists were significantly transformed by their encounter with Jewish sacred texts, so that their own Christian faiths were enriched, revitalized, reshaped, and even attenuated, I'm saying modified. They often came away with a deeper understanding of themselves and their own beliefs. And this was particularly true in Reformation circles. So you can say this, the Christian Hebraism and the study of Jewish texts in Hebrew actually had some effect on the Protestant Reformation. And certainly this back to the scriptures idea meant that, well, first thing you had to do was understand the scriptures. And if you ask Jews about what they thought the scriptures mean, you might come up with quite a Jewish understanding of the scriptures. So that's also an interesting little sort of backwash there between the two religions. And we have other examples. There was Michael Servetus, who used Hebrew sources to give a radical critique of the Trinity and Christianity. And by the 17th century, this field of scholarship, Christian studying Jewish scholarship, was very well established. And you get the two Johannes bookstores, number 1 and number 2, who translated some of the Jewish philosophical works into Latin. In England, you get John Lightfoot and John Selden, who investigated halakha and wrote on the subject. You also get the Dutch scholar William Soren Husius, who translated the Mishnah into Latin and published a bilingual edition in Hebrew and Latin, and wrote a commentary on it. And eventually this tradition, along with the rise of Jewish academic scholars in the 19th century, the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement, developed into the modern field of Jewish studies. So this is where you can trace modern academic study of Judaism. It goes back to all these guys and ultimately to Reuchlin, which is an interesting connection. Now, all this, of course, though closely linked with humanism, is enabled by printing, the new technology, and that was very, very influential indeed, because it meant you could reproduce books and spread them really, really fast. So it wasn't invented by the famous Johannes Gutenberg. It was invented in China, had been known for ages. They've been printing in movable type since 1040, by the way, and doing woodblock printing since 200. So the Chinese are way in advance. But Muslims were block printing extracts from the Quran in the 10th century in Egypt. But movable type, which is the game changer, only reached Europe in 1439. And Johannes Gutenberg became the first European to experiment with it in Mainz in Germany. And by 1450, he'd mastered the technique, and he'd published his first document, which was a German poem. And then he embarked on his huge project to print the entire Bible. That was finished in 1455. And if you look at that, that's the first page of the famous Gutenberg Bible. You can see it looks like a medieval manuscript because, of course, new technologies tend to imitate the technology that came before. So it was painted and colored by hand. All this stuff was done by hand. Just the letters were printed. That's the only bit that's printed. The rest is, yeah, you know, okay, we've whipped out the words really fast. Now we can spend the usual amount of time making it pretty. Some of them were published on parchment, some on paper, which is interesting. His first print run was 180 copies. About 48 have survived. You can see one at the British Library if you come to London. And they cost at the time 30 guilders, which was the equivalent of 3 years' wages for a clerk. That's still cheaper than what you would have paid for a handwritten manuscript Bible. It was still an advance on that. And also much faster to produce. It took about 3 months to print a Gutenberg Bible. It would have taken the scribe 3 years to write out the entire Bible by hand. And this new technology spread very fast. Not all of it is as pretty as that, by the way. Here's a page from the middle of Jeremiah, and you can see, okay, there's a little bit of coloring in the heading and the little footer here. I think that's probably the chapter number for the next chapter, but inside it's pretty plain. So this spreads fast. The red dots here show you where there were printing presses in the year 1470, and you can see mostly Italy with a bit of a spread up to Germany and the Low Countries. But 20 years later, that's where there were printing presses. You could see it really, really took off. And yes, you know, so before the digital revolution, this was the one before that really, really changed the way knowledge is disseminated. So Venice had a press by 1469, but by 1500 it had 417 printers and so on. Krakow got its first press in 1473. And this revolutionized things completely. And Jews were really fast to pick up on this new invention. But it wasn't easy to learn how to print. You know, first of all, printers tended to be a bit private. They didn't want somebody to steal their business, and they weren't going to give away all the trade secrets. And they formed guilds. And in Germany, you had to be a guild member to learn to print, and to be a guild member, you had to be a Christian. But in 1465, two immigrant printers from Germany established themselves in a little town near Rome called Subiaco, printing books in Latin. And we think that they are the people who taught a group of enthusiastic Jews how to print, because the very first Jewish books are around 1469, 1470. And there are about 6 possible candidates for earliest Hebrew book. But the first dated Hebrew book was an edition of the Torah with Rashi's commentary, and that was published in Italy in 1475, down south in Reggio di Calabria, by Avraham ben Garten. And the book actually records it was finished on Friday, the 10th of Adar, 5235, which translates to February the 26th, 1475. In some places, like Portugal, the first book ever printed was a Hebrew book. So definitely in 1487, first printed book of any kind in Hebrew was in Portugal was a Hebrew Chumash. Now, because of Christian censorship and restrictions on Jewish books in the Holy Roman Empire, which we can understand now we've seen the campaign against Jewish books, early Jewish presses tended to be in Italy, Spain, and Portugal. And the first one in Northern Europe was in Prague in 1512. But obviously, after the expulsions in 1492 and 1497, the Hebrew presses of Spain and Portugal were lost. And the center of early Jewish printing after that was Italy. And here we can see some of the results. It wasn't always Jews, by the way, who printed Hebrew books. So one of the most famous is Daniel Bomberg. You may have heard of Bomberg. Born in Antwerp, he moved down to Venice. And he seems to be persuaded by a Jewish convert to Christianity called Felix Pratensis to start printing Hebrew books in 1517. And Bomberg is one of the best known early printers of Hebrew books. He employed Jewish scholars, employed Jews also who had converted to Christianity. I rather wonder what the atmosphere was like in his workshops, all these people working side by side, some of whom obviously hated each other, I should think. And they did the editing and the typesetting. And his printing press produced about 200 different books in total. 2 of the most important are his first and second rabbinic Bibles. This is essentially what we now call Mikraot Gedolot, where you have the biblical text in the middle. Here is the second rabbinic Bible, and this is the first page of Isaiah. You can see the word Chazon, and then the text goes on here, and then if you've got good eyes, you can see it says Ibn Ezra, and here's Ibn Ezra's commentary, and here it says Rashi, and this is Rashi's commentary, and so on. And this format that we're still using is Bomberg's invention, probably. So this laid out the basic format, and actually the text, because if you pick up a Chumash today and it's not a critical edition one, it's just a sort of ordinary Chumash like the Hertz or something, the text actually goes back to this printed edition. That's not a very good text, I have to tell you. No major differences, but some of the voweling's a bit off. You really want to go back to the Aleppo Codex or the Leningrad Codex, or one of the great early sort of 11th century big codexes of the Bible to get clean text. This one is a compendium of different manuscripts, and it's not terribly good, but we're still using it. What the heck? Bomberg was also the first printer to print the entire Talmud in 1523, and here again he established the standard format. Here is the first page of Tractate Beitza. You can see a nice little woodcut heading of the central column, and again he established this format of having Rashi this side and Tosafot on this side. Tosafot existed as several commentaries by lots of different people in different manuscripts, and the printers actually sort of invented the Tosafot we have today by just choosing which bits to shove in. So our current Tosafot, you can still get separate books of Tosafot printed now, but the standard Tosafot we see in the Talmud now is a printer's invention from the 16th century. It's not all one person. Interestingly, a Hebrew press was set up in 1540 by the Christian Hebraist Paul Fagius we were talking about early, helped by Eliar Levitas. So they were actually doing that together. And they started out in southern Germany at a little town called Isny, and then moved to Constance on the German-Swiss border. So that's interesting, got a Jew and a Christian cooperating on equal terms to produce Hebrew books. And they actually did separate editions for Jews and Christians, which again is sort of quite interesting to think of them cooperating on this. And 1553, the Jewish presses in Venice went into decline because the Pope banned the Talmud and ordered it to be burnt. Jewish presses rapidly moved outside Italy at this point, and you get new editions of the Talmud in Lublin, 1559, Salonika, 1563, Basel, 1578. Then the Pope changed his mind, and Hebrew printed started again in Venice in 1569. So Hebrew wasn't being printed just for Jews, however. At the same time, universities in Northern Europe were printing editions of Hebrew texts for all these people who wanted to learn Hebrew, naturally. So Hebrew grammars, books of Psalms, Hebrew Bibles began to appear. You remember Reuchlin persuaded a local printer to do his Hebrew printing, and it caught on. So Tübingen, where there was the university, started its own Christian-run press in 1511 that just did Hebrew. Augsburg, Basel, other university cities in Germany followed suit where textbooks were needed, because textbooks are good money. If anyone's ever written a book that became a textbook, that's really the thing to do. Naturally, it was harder for non-Jewish printers who might not actually read Hebrew themselves to make sure their products were accurate, unless they had Jews as part of the team. And when a man called Abraham Braunschweig edited and printed an edition of the Hebrew Bible for one of those bookstores in 1618, he included an elaborate apology to Jewish readers of the book because it had an awful lot of errors. He said, well, unfortunately, I have non-Jewish printers working on the Sabbath when the Jews can't work, and they make mistakes. So it's a rather charming admission that maybe he wasn't, I can't think why he didn't get the Jews to proofread it, but obviously he didn't. Now, obviously, the introduction of printing raised a lot of halachic questions, like, well, if you could print books, could you print Sefer Torah? Could you print Tefillin? Could you print mezuzahs? What about get? All these questions came up, and you have an explosion in halachic writing from this era of people deciding, and actually they're remarkably undecided. I think it was pretty clear that no, Sefer Torah, no. But there was a big, long-running discussion about what was called the Sefer Haftarta, a book of Haftorahs. Could you print a book just of the Haftorahs for each parsha, which would be very handy to have in shul, because you just turn the page. They still exist, by the way. And there were huge arguments about whether you could or whether you couldn't. We won't go into the minutiae, but actually right down to today, there is opinion divided on this. And there are still some people who say if you can get a handwritten copy of the books of Nevi'im, that is what you should be reading Haftorah out of, and not out of a printed book. As we all know, we all ignore that. But there are still some halachic opinions that go, well, that's really what you should be doing. And another important effect of printing was the standardization of the pagination of the Talmud. So the fact that we can now say Beitza 6, 6b, and all know what page we are in the Talmud. Again, it goes back to Bomberg, and it goes back to this pagination that was adopted for all editions, which makes life much, much easier, as you know. Another fallout was many small Jewish communities had their own tradition of tefillah, which was either in manuscript or was orally passed on, and they had small variations here and there, and those got wiped out by printers, because printers were not going to print a Siddur for the little village of, I don't know, Calabrione de Mestiza or somewhere, which had, 33 Jews. They would print one for the city of Naples, and the villages around Naples would have to use that if they wanted a Siddur. So actually, it decreased diversity in the Jewish world. And sometimes we have manuscripts of these lost particular traditions of prayer that nobody is doing anymore because we printed Siddurim and Machzorim, wiped them out, which is rather sad. So we've had a look at Reuchlin, who I'm very fond of, I have to say. We've had a look at Christian Hebraism and the development of the non-Jewish interest in the study of the Jewish great classical literature tradition. And we've had a look at how printing was also involved in that. Three things that are very, very much tied together. So we could pursue that down the centuries, but as I said, next week we will jump about 300 years and we will look at the effect on Jewish-Christian relations of the Holocaust and of how the discussion, certainly at the official level, has developed between Judaism and Christianity from that point on. And I will just have a look at the chat, and if anyone has got any other questions, please ask. At that time, could you be a non-Christian humanist? Yeah, you could be a Jewish humanist. Elia Levita was a very classic Jewish humanist. Which Christian denominations? It wasn't really that formal being a humanist. It was a bit like being an academic. Denominations didn't really have policies on what professions you could be. Plus, this is the point when denominations are evolving. So, it's all very unsettled in the early 16th century, and they haven't got, they're arguing about the nature of the Trinity and what you do at Mass. They're not interested at all in humanists, you might say, because they had a critical sense, tended to end up on the Protestant side, but not always. Reuchlin was a Catholic throughout his life. So you didn't have to, it was perhaps easier to be a Protestant humanist, but it was by no means exclusive at all. Interesting, the Jewish attitude to translating Torah to other languages flipped during the Enlightenment era. Well, it had flipped a bit before. The first Jewish translation of the Torah is 300 BCE, the Septuagint, into Greek. Closely followed by the Aramaic translations, which we still use, the Targums, which date from, well, nobody quite knows, but probably the first 2, 3, 4 centuries of the Christian era. And yeah, we've been translating for a long, long, long time. So Jewish translation of the Bible, we were the first people who translated it, and we're still doing it. And there have been lots and lots of Jewish translations of the Bible throughout history. Was Amsterdam a big printing area later on? I think so. Antwerp, Amsterdam, I think definitely. That might be more 17th century. But there's a fabulous book called Printing the Talmud by, I can't even remember who, but that's the place to go if you're interested in the whole evolution of the printing of the Talmud, which is fascinating because that takes into questions of censorship and so on and so forth. So any other questions I can help with? Oh, Shelley, yes.
Yes, I noticed that you put in David Ruderman's Early Modern Jewish History. So this isn't about what we were doing this week, but when I read his book, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, or whenever I read it, he said something about the blood libel that made me just absolutely plot. He said that the reason why Christians did the blood libel was because Jews killed their children rather than let them convert in the earlier Crusades. And they figured that if Jews would kill their own children, they could certainly be killing Christian children and using the blood for that. Do you remember reading that in any of his books?
I don't remember reading that at all. I don't think he'd say anything as crude as that. He might have said a factor in, or I don't know. I'll have to go back and have a look. So I can't actually comment because I can't remember reading that at all in his book. It's a very good book, Early Modern Jewry. It's very interesting. It has a whole chapter that's very interesting on conversion, actually. Backwards and forwards, which is very interesting too. I'll have a look at it again, see if I find anything. Remind me next week, and I'll see if I find anything about that. Okay. Any other Yes, Martin Heller, that's right. Thank you so much. Printing the Jabba by Martin Heller. Yes. Yeah, I've been looking for a copy for ages for myself, but I've had to look at it in libraries, and it's a really, really interesting book. Any other last minute questions? Nope. Okay, so I look forward to seeing you next week for our final get together on this course, and maybe we'll meet on future courses. Thank you all so much.
Thank
And,
you, Rabba Lindsey.
very much for your wonderful-
Excellent, as always. Can't believe that you fit so much in every hour. It's just chock full of.
I sometimes think I should talk
things.
slower and fit less in, but then I think, oh, I can't leave that out.
Beautiful. Thank you
Well,
so
I
much.
haven't heard anybody say slow down or tell us less, right?
I often get asked to slow down. Maybe it's just the people who can cope who've stayed on the course.
They're recorded for a reason.
That's
You know,
right.
There we are, yeah.
That's right. I did post again one more time about the link to the PASOK series. We have 13 classes in 2 weeks, I think, less than 2 weeks maybe. So there'll be wonderful speakers, wonderful topics. So in between drawers and countertops and whatever else, and shopping and cooking, you can leave us on in the background to give you some koach while you're prepping and everything else. So take a look at the series and look forward to seeing everybody here next week for Rabba Lindsey's last class in this series. Have a wonderful week. Take good care, everybody.
Thank you very much. It's really fascinating.
Glad
Very.
you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.